All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the last night of the fall webinar series. We're super excited to have you again for one final time. It's hard to believe it's already November. Here with us tonight, we have Dr. Jason Smith. He's going to be talking to us about some factors that influence the value of cattle destined for the feed yard. So I won't waste any more time. I'll let him take the floor.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here and visit with y'all tonight over the next hour or so. And I have to admit, we planned on doing this a little differently. We had initially planned to be able to host a virtual feed yard tour. That hasn't quite come together yet, at least not to the extent to where we can host it and it be recorded and a few other things. And so we're still working towards that. So hopefully in the coming years, we'll maybe be able to come back or circle back around to that and be able to provide one of those. I am going to take a few minutes at the very beginning though, and provide a brief overview of the feed yard. I'm going to tackle that from a very broad, a 30,000 foot view, but I want to take the time to do that because I do think it's important that if we're producing a product that we understand what's going to happen to that product once it goes on to either the next or potentially the final user of that product, at least from the live animal standpoint. So a lot of this is going to be focused primarily at the cow-calf level. But after that brief overview of the feed yard, I want to focus on some of the major factors that can influence the value of feeder cattle. Okay, spend a little bit of time talking about genetics, but want to spend the bulk of it talking about management practices. Okay, with a focus on weaning and preconditioning as being two of those major management practices that we can use to influence value of feeder cattle, and hopefully do it in a way that yields a positive return on its investment. A couple things I would encourage you to consider here out of the gate, though, would be, as I work through and present some of this content, I'd ask that you think about it in the context of what you currently are or are not doing on your operation. Okay, and think about it from the perspective of, is there opportunity to increase profitability? And if so, can you feasibly adopt some of the necessary strategies into your system that would allow you to access some of that additional income or some of the cost savings that would result in that added or increased profitability? The reality is that if you miss or you don't take advantage of opportunities to add value to your feeder cattle, at least from a management standpoint, someone else is going to. They're going to buy those calves at a discounted price point that is discounted enough to justify the risk level of those cattle. Okay, so to account for what they expect those cattle to come in at under whatever their baseline is, or to cover the additional costs of problems that may come along for the ride with those cattle, whether that's morbidity or mortality or some other things that might contribute to cost of those animals. Okay, but they're going to use that as an opportunity to capitalize on the previous missed opportunity in those animals, and that owner is going to do something to try to recuperate as much of that value as possible. And I mentioned that, and I think it's a really important concept that we at least appreciate, because that means there is potentially opportunity for us to share or even capture all of that value on the front end with those calves. I'm often asked, what is a silver bullet? What is the ticket? What are the keys to profitability or making money with cow-calf production? And the reality is, it's a lot of little pieces that make up that entire puzzle. But we want to make sure that we don't miss those opportunities that we could potentially and feasibly take advantage of. So I encourage you to think about some of those things as we work through this material. I also want to talk about a little bit about on the dynamics of the cattle industry in the U.S. And I'm going to show you a map from 2002, so it's about 20 years old. But the concept that I'm trying to get across still holds true today. We really have not seen a major shift in where cattle are located in the U.S. There's a couple things I want to point out about this, and this first map shows beef cow inventory. Okay, and so a dot represents 5,000 beef cows. One of the points I want to mention, and I know you all appreciate, is that if we look at that Mid-South region, Tennessee and Kentucky, from a cow-calf production standpoint, it's as concentrated as anywhere in the United States. And so you are producing a lot of feeder cattle. The reality, though, is that the majority of those cattle are not fed. Those cattle converge into Tornado Alley to be fed. Okay, and so what I've transitioned to is cattle on feed. So really the concentration of where feed yards are located and where those calves are going to be finished. Now, some calves are going to be retained and finished locally, but in the grand scheme of things, the vast majority of those calves are not. So the average calf produced in Tennessee or wherever you might be sitting at tonight, there's a good likelihood that that calf is going to wind up on feed somewhere in the Great Plains. Okay, and with the largest concentration of those cattle being fed where I'm sitting at tonight in the Texas Panhandle. Okay, we've got a couple pockets, but if we look at this area of the Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, and the Oklahoma Panhandle, that's going to represent about 6 million fed cattle marketed per year. Okay, so a very large chunk of the overall cattle that are fed in the United States. But the important part of this that I think we need to recognize from a cow-calf production standpoint is the majority of those calves are not going to stay local, and they're going to travel a considerable distance to be placed on feed. Whether those calves are going to eastern Iowa or they're coming to the western part of the Panhandle. Okay, it's a pretty far trip, regardless of which one of those calves are going to, or anywhere in between. We know a lot of cattle from your part of the world may not make it to the Texas Panhandle. They may be fed in Iowa or eastern Nebraska or even western Kansas. But some of those cattle are coming out here, and all of them, at least that are traveling to the Great Plains, spend quite a bit of time on the truck. Okay, and I want to focus in a little bit on some of the things we can do to minimize the risk of some of the problems that might come along with that. But as I mentioned initially, do want to take a few minutes to do about a 30,000 foot view of the feed yard. So those cattle have left Tennessee, they've left the Mid-South, and they're going to a feed yard somewhere. Okay, and likely somewhere in the Great Plains. Okay, so they're going to spend a considerable amount of time on the truck before they get there. Once they get there, they're going to be weighed on the truck as the truck pulls into the yard, or they're going to be weighed somewhere locally prior to those trucks pulling onto the yard, and then they're going to be unloaded into a receiving pen. Depending upon the operation, depending upon the amount of time those cattle have spent on a truck, and depending upon their risk level, those calves are going to be allowed to eat, drink, and rest prior to processing. And that rest may be as short as a half an hour, and it might be as long as a day or more prior to those calves being processed. But by and large, with the majority of calves resting somewhere in the vicinity of a few hours prior to being processed. Okay, regardless of what has happened to cattle in the past. Okay, so regardless of their vaccination record, their deworming record, their implant record, the vast majority of cattle are going to be vaccinated, dewormed, and implanted on arrival to the feed yard. Okay, now there's some exceptions to that. If we're talking about natural or NHTC type cattle, so somewhere in the vicinity, maybe 5% of the cattle that are fed, that may not be the case for some of those cattle, but by and large, almost all cattle are going to be vaccinated, dewormed, and implanted either on arrival or slightly delayed, but not long after arrival. Okay, depending upon the need and more specifically the risk level and the type of cattle that are coming into the yard, they may be individually identified. A large portion of them will not be. Okay, if they are identified, they're likely going to get a lot number tag and or a pin number tag. Okay, they may not be individually identified. Okay, they may be administered a metaphylactic antibiotic treatment. Okay, so high-risk calves may all receive an antibiotic on arrival to help control an outbreak of respiratory disease, or they may strategically be treated based upon certain criteria that are measured as those calves come across the chute. If they haven't already been, bull calves are going to be castrated, and calves with horns are going to be dehorned, or more likely going to be tipped. Okay, once they get to the feed yard, if they haven't been dehorned but they needed to be, because of the stress that's going to put on that animal at that size and at that age, they are likely just going to be tipped. So have the very outer portion of their horns cut off in a way that's relatively painless, but prevents that point from forming on the horn. Okay, heifers are going to be pregnancy checked and possibly administered an abortifacient, so something like a prostaglandin, like Lutalyse or Estramate or another, to ensure that if they weren't open, they will be soon, because they absolutely want to do everything they can to avoid heifers calving a decent ways into the feeding period because of the problems associated with that. Okay, so after processing, cattle are going to be sent to a home pen. In most situations, they're going to be pinned with that same load lot that they arrived on. Okay, there's a chance that if there's a number of loads coming in at the same time, they might get sorted into some light groups, but more often than not, those cattle are going to be purchased and arrive in groups that are sized based upon the pen or pens that they're going to go into once they get there. Hence, some of the reason why there's added value in selling calves in load lots rather than individuals or small groups. Okay, because that's how they're likely eventually going to be purchased and placed on feed by the feed yard. Once they get to their home pen, they're typically going to be ridden or checked for health issues by a pen rider at least once per day. Here in the Panhandle, the average pen rider is going to be responsible for covering somewhere in the vicinity of 7,000 to 10,000 head of cattle per day, every single day. Okay, their job primarily would be to evaluate those cattle and identify those that need to be removed from their pen for some reason. Okay, those cattle are going to have their waters cleaned regularly. Okay, so as regularly as possible, but absolutely checked at least daily. And then they're going to be fed a total mixed ration at least once per day. Most feed yards, at least here in this region, we look at relatively large feed yards, so anywhere from 30,000 to upwards of over 100,000 head yards. Those cattle are likely going to have feed placed in their bunks 2 to 3 times per day. Okay, a large portion of that being logistics. Okay, then cattle are, best case scenario, cattle are going to remain in their home pen until they're pulled to potentially be reimplanted, and then again stay in their home pen after that until they're ready to be shipped to a packer. The reality is that will not be the case for all. Okay, so some of those cattle are going to get pulled by the pen rider due to either a sickness or an injury, or they've been identified as a buller. Either they're the one doing the bulling, so riding other cattle, or they're the one that is constantly being ridden by other cattle. Okay, so those animals are going to be removed, as well as any animals that are unthrifty, aren't performing. They're potentially going to be moved in what we would refer to as be railed. So they're going to go ahead and be marketed, similar to marketing a cull cow or a cull bull, to recuperate some salvage value, but to minimize the loss associated with continuing to feed that animal. Okay. The goal while they're there is to maximize energy consumption and optimize their efficiency and nutrient utilization. We're trying to get them to gain as effectively, as rapidly, and as efficiently as possible, but do it at a low cost, or try to minimize that cost while also promoting beef quality. Okay, so trying to strike that optimal balance between all of those things. Those cattle are going to get started on a high fiber, low starch, roughage based ration. In this region, large portion of the feed yards are they will purchase one complete ration. They'll make the rest of the rations on site, but often that one complete ration that they will purchase is one starting ration. Okay, because of the logistics and the problems associated with adding additional rations to the feed yard, at least that have to be manufactured, and the issues associated with handling large amounts of roughages and rations that are composed primarily of roughages. Then the cattle are going to gradually be transitioned to a low fiber, high starch, high grain finishing ration over somewhere in the vicinity of a 21 to 42 day period. 21 to 28 days is going to capture most what I'll call yearlings, so 6 to 7 or 8 weight calves being placed on feed. Potentially calf fed, so wean calves that would be coming on feed would be transitioned potentially over a longer period of time, or they'd undergo a 60 to 90 day backgrounding or growing phase prior to being placed on that finishing ration. Okay. I've mentioned the concept of minimizing the number of rations on the feed yard. That's pretty important from a logistical standpoint. There's situations where adding a ration may add an additional hour or more to feeding time on that yard that's already potentially maxed out on the amount of time they can spend delivering feed to cattle on any given day. And so most feed yards, at least in this region, and I think this applies across the greater portion of the Great Plains for our medium to large size feed yards, maybe not as much farmer feeders, but our medium to large size feed yards are going to transition cattle using a 2 ration blending system. It's where the first feed delivery may be that starter ration, and then the second feed delivery for the day may be that finishing ration. And over time, they're going to change the proportions of those that are provided to cattle throughout the day to eventually get them stepped up onto roughly 100% of that finishing ration, which is going to be composed primarily of corn, or depending upon price, some other cereal grains. There might be times where we feed wheat. There might be times where we feed milo or sorghum. But in most situations, that grain is going to be processed. Here in the Southern Plains, because of our energy costs, it's going to be steam flaked. In the Northern Plains, it's likely going to be dry rolled, or what we refer to back east as cracked, or it's going to have been ensiled as high moisture corn. Roughly 20% of that dry matter is going to come from a corn milling byproduct, either distillers grains or corn gluten feed. About 10% of that the dry matter in that ration is going to be roughage. That may range from anywhere in the 5 to 7% range up to upwards of 13 to 15%, depending upon management. Okay, and then the remaining 5% of the dry matter is going to be micro ingredients. So ingredients such as minerals, vitamins, additives, ingredients that might have a specific physical or technical effect in the ration, or any drugs that might be added. So if we look at a 22-pound average dry matter intake, and I think that would characterize a lot of Tennessee type cattle. On an as-fed basis, they're going to eat about 18 pounds of steam flake corn, about 15 pounds of wet distillers grains, about 2.5 pounds of corn stalks, and a little over a pound of minerals, vitamins, additives, and other micro ingredients. Notice those don't add up to 22. That 22 is on a dry basis, and these are on an as-fed basis. But from a logistics standpoint, something that is just amazing to me, and I think it's important to wrap our heads around, is if I'm going to characterize the average feed yard in this area as roughly a 60 to 65,000 head yard. That yard has to source, batch, and deliver about 2.25 million pounds of feed to its cattle every single day of the year. Think about that from a logistic standpoint. Okay, if that's 120,000 head yard, that's closer to 5 million pounds of feed that yard has to source, batch, and deliver to its cattle every day. So there's an incredible amount of planning and logistics and coordination that goes into feeding cattle commercially. Okay. I think I saw a hand raised. Mallory, I don't know with the webinar format, if we have a way to go ahead and answer those questions in real time, or if we need to wait to the end, but if we can answer them in real time, I'd like to go ahead and do that so we don't potentially miss it at the very end. And here we're at a pretty decent transition point to do that if it's possible.
No problem. If whoever raised their hand wants to type it in the Q&A box or the chat box, please do so. We can
Okay.
take a little break for that.
Yep. And what we might do is I might keep going on just in the essence of time, but Mallory, if you wouldn't mind, if that does come in, just stop me and ask me and we'll address it then. Does that work?
Okay, sounds good.
Perfect. Okay. So if you do have questions on the feed yard, again, that's a 30,000 foot view. Okay. Taking a very complex process and absolutely oversimplifying it. But I think that does a good job of showing the reality of what's going to happen to cattle and maybe addresses what might be some of our misperceptions of what might happen to cattle when they get to the feed yard. Now, if you're retaining ownership in calves at a relatively smaller custom feeder, that may be different. You know, those calves are likely going to get individually identified and they may have some additional check weights throughout the feeding period and some of those kinds of things. But by and large, those cattle that are sold to a feed yard, this paints a pretty decent picture of their experience once they get there and throughout that time until they're eventually shipped to the packer. Okay. So think about factors though that are ultimately going to influence the value of those cattle. I'm going to break those into three main categories. Those are going to be the factors that have the greatest influence on one, the likelihood of that animal surviving through finishing. And I don't mean to sound morbid, but the reality is that not all calves are gonna survive from weaning to finishing. Okay, that's independent of whether those calves come here to a feed yard, they stay there locally, they run on grass or whatever. There's a portion of those calves that from a health standpoint and immune system standpoint, and for some other reasons are not going to survive throughout that entire process. The second of those is going to be what it costs to finish the animal. Okay. And then lastly, what it's worth at the end of that. Okay. So what its value is to the packer or whoever is going to potentially be purchasing that animal from that feeder. Okay. We've taken some of our historical data. And so this is data collected from the Texas A&M Ranch to Rail program. Okay. And so this is a summary of about 10 years worth of data from a program where ranches retained ownership in feeder cattle and fed them here in the Panhandle or fed them at other yards in Texas. And what I've done is just put together this pie chart of the major contributors to costs of finishing those animals. Okay, by and large, the majority of those costs are what it costs to purchase the animal and what it costs to feed it. Okay, the remaining couple percent might be processing costs, drugs or doctoring expenses, interest, and then death loss. Okay. Now, please understand that these are not necessarily fixed in that they may be substantially impacted by different traits, different characteristics of those animals and different management. Okay. If we have a really high risk group of calves, that is a train wreck and we experience 15 to 20% death loss. Death loss just became one of the major costs in finishing these animals. Okay, but in most situations we would expect far lower than that. Just ballpark, we're going to expect roughly somewhere in the vicinity of 1/2 of 1 to 2% death loss will cover most groups of cattle once they get to the feed yard. Okay, but by and large, the majority of the cost, other than what it costs to purchase the animal, is what it costs to feed it. Okay, so if we think about ways we can influence those three main contributors to cost and value, genetics play a large role in essentially all of those factors. So if we think about survival and finishing costs, frame size, growth potential, the number of days it's going to take to finish that animal, its feed efficiency, its health, and its ability to withstand environmental stressors. Those are all things that have genetic roots. Anything we measure or see in an animal has a genetic component, and I encourage you to keep that in the back of your mind. Anything we see is a combination or an interaction between that animal's genetics and its environment. Okay, so we can influence all of those things, and then also we can influence a lot of factors that contribute to value of that animal to the packer. Okay, so all of these things contribute to the age in which that animal is harvested. And if that animal is a certain age, we may experience a large discount because of how that influences how that beef can be marketed, and more importantly, who that beef can potentially be marketed to. Okay, lean color is going to be impacted by temperament and docility. Okay, quality grade impacted by marbling potential. Yield grade impacted by carcass weight, by ribeye area, by kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, by back fat thickness. Okay, carcass weight impacted by genetics for growth potential, and then program acceptance. So what boxes can those animals potentially check? Some of those have genetic roots. Use certified Angus beef or certified Hereford beef as just prime examples of those that most of us are familiar with or have heard of. Mallory, before we go on, you want to go ahead and ask that question really quick? It looks like there's one that came in.
Yeah. Is that 22-pound feed ratio on a per head basis, or what is the goal intake of the average head on arrival to a feed yard?
Yep. So that, I'm going to get back to that slide really quick. So that 22 pounds is what I'm going to consider to be the average dry matter intake over the entire duration of time that animal spends at the feed yard. Okay. So that's pounds of dry matter per head per day consumption. We would expect that the average calf is going to convert that to gain somewhere in the vicinity of 6 to 1. I think right now, if we were to cover most of our bases with most cattle, somewhere in the vicinity of 6 to 1 to 6.5 to 1 pounds of feed dry matter per pound of gain will cover conversion for most cattle. So on average, we're going to expect cattle to do somewhere in the vicinity of 3.5 pounds per head per day average daily gain at that level of intake. Now, the other portion of that question is really, what are we trying to get cattle to achieve some of those objectives that I mentioned? Our goal is to get cattle to eat as much as they are willing to eat during that time that they're there. Okay. Anytime we don't do that and we extend the amount of time that we have to feed an animal, we're going to say roughly 50 to 60% at a finishing level. We'll just call it 60% of what that animal is consuming is going to maintain itself. Every day we extend that feeding period, that 60% of what it's eating, that's not going to gain. And so we want to try to maximize gain in most situations. And one of the ways we do that is maximize intake. Now, please don't confuse that with filling the bunk every time it's empty. Okay, so the majority of feed bunks are going to be managed on a slick bunk basis. And so what that means is they're going to be managed to try to provide cattle with 100% of the feed that they are willing to eat during that 24-hour period of time without overfeeding them. Okay, and so that feed call, so what that feed truck driver is asked to deliver to the bunk every day is likely going to be adjusted to try to achieve that slick bunk basis, but maximize the amount of feed that cattle are consuming. Okay. In terms of starting cattle, that's going to be very feed yard dependent. But if I had to paint a picture that covers most of them. Those calves are probably going to be started on either free choice access to long stem hay or free choice access to that receiving ration that I mentioned that's going to be incredibly high roughage until the cattle are processed. And then from there, they're probably going to be started at somewhere in the vicinity of 1.25 to 1.5% of their body weight in dry matter, if they'll eat that much. If they won't eat that much, they're going to be back down lower than that. And then they're slowly going to be increased potentially every day or every other day until they get up somewhere in the vicinity of close to 1.75 to 2% of their body weight in dry matter. And then those small increases are going to become even smaller, and they're going to become more spread out to where those increases are likely only going to occur once every 2 or 3 days. And then the cattle are probably going to have a maximum level of intake. So at a given number of days on feed, that nutritionist is probably going to prescribe that those cattle don't be offered more than a certain amount of feed to try to avoid overfeeding those cattle. Okay, maybe gave a little more information than you were asking for there, but those were really, really good questions, and they did present the opportunity to address some of those things that I breezed over and didn't cover yet. Okay, but if that didn't answer the question, don't hesitate to follow that question up, and I'll have Mallory stop me and we'll answer it a little on down the road. Okay. So let me get back to where we were. So making genetic improvements. So how do we influence some of those things? I'm not a geneticist. I'm not going to pretend to be one. I know you all have already had some genetics topics in this series, and I think you all have some upcoming educational opportunities on the genetic selection side, at least there in Tennessee in the coming weeks. So I'd encourage you to consider those. Y'all have phenomenal genetics resources there at the University of Tennessee. So I encourage you to utilize some of those people. You've got phenomenal resources from an educational standpoint. You have phenomenal resources from a seed stock cattle standpoint, and I've been blessed with the opportunity to work with some of those educators and some of those producers that produce some of those genetics. And so I'd certainly encourage you to capitalize on those opportunities. Okay, but if I were going to summarize how we can utilize them to influence the value of feeder cattle, EPDs and selection indices are going to be some of our most valuable genetic tools to do that. Genomic enhancements, I don't see any reason for us from a seed stock standpoint to not be using those technologies, because they help to remove some of the guessing in that game. And so I would encourage you to use EPDs, use selection indices, and focus on those animals that those EPDs and selection indices are genomically enhanced. I'm also a believer that actual phenotypic observations and data, so what we see and what we measure, are still important. I think it's incredibly difficult for us to manage what we don't measure. And so I'm a huge proponent of identifying those cattle that are rock stars from an EPD and a genetic standpoint, but they can back it up in the real world. So they have the phenotype to match that. And I think we have the opportunity to evaluate those. And again, I think y'all have an educational opportunity coming up here in the next few weeks that really focus in how to do that. So I'd encourage you to embrace that opportunity. The other thing that I think we have an opportunity to do is take advantage of planned hybrid vigor. That's something that historically nationwide we have done a poor job of. It continues to be far underutilized, and we have the opportunity to substantially improve feeder cattle value through doing so. Avoid single trait selection, or what I'll call even few trait selection. If our only criteria are birth weight, weaning weight, and yearling weight, we are going to bring along some things for the ride that we didn't want to come along for that ride. Those are going to be things that influence cow-calf productivity, but also influence the value of feeder cattle. And so we have the opportunity to make progress in those directions, but also select other traits that are going to be very economically relevant to us. One of the things that drives me nuts as somebody that loves cattle, somebody that's devoted their career to it, it drives me nuts when I have a poor beef eating experience. And so I'd ask you, have you ever eaten a steak that you didn't like? There was a genetic component to that. Genetics contributed to that outcome. And so I'd encourage you to embrace the opportunity to minimize the risk of that happening, because ultimately that is dramatically important to value of feeder cattle through demand. Okay. So again, I'd encourage you to focus on away from either single or even few trait selection and focus on multi-trait selection. One thing that I think, and I've seen a lot of people go down this rabbit hole and maybe go a little too far down this rabbit hole, or at least lose sight of some of the other things that are important, is just focusing on carcass traits as their focus toward impacting the value of cattle to the feed yard. And while that may impact what someone is willing to pay that feed yard for the cattle, there are a lot of other costs that feed yard incurs to get cattle to that point. Okay. And so in an example that I'll use would be in our current feed price environment, which is not good. It's not favorable and conducive to feeding cattle. But in our current feed price environment, making an improvement in feed efficiency, reducing that feed efficiency by 1 pound of dry matter per pound of gain. So going from a 6-to-1 feed conversion down to a 5-to-1 feed conversion will have roughly the same economic impact on feeding those cattle and their ultimate value as taking 100% of those cattle from grading choice to 100% of those cattle grading prime. Okay. Roughly the same impact. Okay. It impacts that through a different way. It impacts it through reducing feeding costs rather than improving the value of the carcass. The reason I bring that up and use that example is not to discourage you from focusing on carcass traits, but to encourage you to focus on other performance phenotypic attributes that will impact what it costs to feed cattle, but at the same time put that positive selection pressure on carcass traits. We can identify bulls and utilize bulls that check the majority of boxes. Okay. If we utilize some artificial insemination, even at the commercial level, that opens the door to a tremendous number of those animals. But even if we're not doing that, even if we are using 100% natural service sires to breed cows, we can find a lot of bulls that check those boxes that we need them to and can help move us in the right direction. Okay, that's about the extent I'm gonna talk on the genetic side, though, because I don't want to get too terribly far out of my own wheelhouse. But it looks like we got another question that's come in, so I may go ahead and have you ask that one to me now if you want. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read that out. So focusing on genetics that are not specific to carcass weight, what's the cost to do so, and how does one measure that value if you can't realize it as a feeder producer? Okay, so I think the last part of that question is really important one to address, and that I haven't mentioned yet, but will mention a little later on. And I think this follow-up question is genetics downstream can't be realized by small producers ? I think that's an important thing to consider. So the first part of that is if we don't market cattle in a way that helps us to realize some of that value, you're absolutely right. We may be making those decisions and making those changes because they're the right thing for the industry, but we're not returning that value at the cow-calf level unless we're marketing cattle in a way that captures it. Okay, and I think that is the key. That is the key to doing so, is marketing cattle in a way that allows us to capture it. Now, we've often thought if we're small scale producers, so we've got 10, 15, 20, 30, however many cows, we don't have the opportunity to market cattle in a way that allows us to realize or return some of that value. And particularly in Tennessee, I don't think that's the case, because there's been a tremendous amount of effort there that's been put forth put into cooperative feeder cattle marketing programs. And the exact name that's used for those programs popularly is passing me right now, so I'm drawing a blank on it. But some of those marketing pools and cooperative feeder cattle programs where producers that are producing similar type cattle with similar focus can market those cattle together are absolutely opportunities to return some of that value. The other thing I would say in response to that is that in a lot of situations, it costs me the same to use that bull, to use that sire that brings along a lot of those other positive traits for the ride. And it may not cost me more to find that same bull that checks those boxes that I've previously been requiring one to check, but check some of those other boxes as well. Okay, so I'd encourage you to consider those things moving forward. But ultimately, if we're not marketing them in a way to capture that value, we're not going to return that directly. And if it costs us more to incorporate those genetics, that's just been an expense, and that's probably not a winning venture for the enterprise. Okay. All right. So moving on, some of the visual factors that influence value. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but breed composition. The reality is that if those cattle show ear influence to a substantial degree, they're typically going to sell for less than those that don't. If they show dairy influence, they're going to sell for less than those that don't. If they're cattle that are not very uniform, so they're a heterogeneous group, okay, if they don't all look the same and they do all look somewhat different, okay, that's going to affect what someone's willing to pay for those animals. Okay, frame size, okay, muscularity, color, hair coat. These are all things that may influence value that we have the opportunity to influence through genetics. And so I'd encourage you to consider some of those. And I'm not using these to say one is necessarily better than the other, but be familiar with the opportunities that may exist for you to add value to your calf crop through that genetic change. Now, where I want to transition to and focus a little more on is or are some of the management factors or practices that we can use that might influence feeder cattle value. So one of those is condition or fleshiness. Okay. So generally speaking, fleshy cattle are going to be worth less on a dollars per hundredweight or a dollars per pound basis than those that would be qualified as thin or normal fleshed. Okay, that's because of the perception that those cattle aren't going to experience compensatory gain and are going to have poorer feed conversion at the feed yard. I would argue that is absolutely not always the case. Okay, but nonetheless, that is the general perception, and generally speaking, there are premiums and discounts associated with that. So we want to try to ensure through management, we're just not making cattle overly fleshy. Okay, castration, huge opportunity to capitalize on the value of our bull calves by making them steers before we sell them. Okay. And most previously, the past few years, that's been worth about $50. Okay. The current year and the current market conditions, that's worth closer to $100 per head by castrating one. We can do it far, far, far cheaper than that, and pick your poison, pick your technique. I don't care how they're castrated as long as they're effectively castrated. Okay. And that's the important component is if you're going to castrate them, make sure you can effectively remove both testicles. If there's a chance you're only going to remove one, don't touch them. Leave those a bull and then either have a veterinarian or someone with more experience help you or market them as such. What we don't want to do is market calves that were ineffectively castrated. Okay. And then weaning status, whether those calves are balling or not. Okay, that's going to be our major indicator as whether or not those calves are going to be discounted because of some of the issues that may come along for the ride with those calves. Okay, the reality is that calves are going to get weaned one way or another. We have the option; we can make the choice to wean them prior to selling them, or they're going to get weaned as a part of that process. So I would encourage you all to consider utilizing that as an opportunity to capture some of that value. Reality is weaning is generally the most stressful event that cattle are going to experience during their lifetime. Okay. Cattle that aren't stressed rarely get sick, or at least they rarely develop respiratory disease. And I think that's a really important component. And that's one of the major factors that have contributed to the added value associated with weaning and preconditioning. Okay. When we sell calves, we stress them. Okay. We gather them, we transport them during that time. They might be restricted for some period of time of feed and of water. They're likely going to get commingled with other calves in some way, shape, or form. On their way to either where they're being grouped or laying over prior to going to the sale barn or going straight to the sale barn. Okay. Then those calves are probably going to get transported again where they're going to undergo feed and water restriction. Okay. In a lot of situations that might be happening and they may be going to an environment that's completely different than they're used to. They might be coming to this dust storm. This is a picture that was taken just outside of our research feed yard here just west of Amarillo about a year ago. Okay. We might have had calves arrive that day that got to experience that coming through. Now in a situation where those calves have been highly stressed, they're very likely to get sick in response to that. Okay. Eventually they get to where they're going. Okay. Once they get to where they're going, as I mentioned, they're gonna be processed. If necessary, they're gonna be castrated. They're gonna get tipped or dehorned. They're gonna get vaccinated, dewormed, etc. Okay, after they've been rested. And so that video is just a group of newly received wheat pasture cattle that were resting prior to processing those calves. Okay, so those would be heavy yearlings that'll go on or did go on feed. Okay, then after that process, those calves are going to get turned out or put in a pen. Okay, turned out if they're going to a stocker operation, but if they're going straight to the feed yard, they're going to get put into a pen where they're expected to figure out how to eat and drink. Okay, reality is those that don't cope with that very well look like this rascal that's laying down on the right. Okay, that calf is a problem. Okay, he represents a problem for me if I'm the person that just purchased him. So we want to try to minimize the risk of that happening. One, that's a problem from a financial standpoint. It's a problem from a production standpoint. But probably more important than all those, not probably, more important than all those things is that's a problem from a welfare standpoint. Okay, I don't want cattle to get sick. I want cattle to stay healthy. Okay, so we want to do everything we can to minimize the risk of that happening. Okay, the reason why there's been a tremendous amount of focus on health and really what's contributed to the development of weaning and preconditioning programs, and at least formally as we know them, and the premiums associated with that would be that cattle that get sick at the feed yard experience reductions in growth. Okay, they're less efficient. They're more likely to die. They cost more. Okay, they cost more to get them to their finished endpoint. Okay, and ultimately they either decrease profitability or increase the loss on that animal, depending upon the market conditions. And so this table shows some data, and this is a summary of data, again, a 10-year summary from that Texas A&M Ranch to Rail program. Interestingly enough, that Texas A&M Ranch to Rail program and this data, really these 4 points, were what originally led to the development of what we know as the VAC, insert whatever number you want to, preconditioning programs. Okay. What led to that development was the identification that calves that get sick experience a 10 to 20% reduction in average daily gain. They're 5 to 10-fold more likely to die while they're on feed. Okay. They cost 15 to 20% more to finish them. And ultimately that generally translates into them being profitable versus not being profitable from a feeding standpoint. Okay. And so ultimately that has led to weaning and preconditioning being one of the key management practices that we can employ to influence the likelihood or risk of morbidity and mortality at the feed yard. Okay. Vaccination programs, another tremendous opportunity that we have. Early castration and dehorning, so doing those things prior to those calves being stressed, prior to them getting to the feed yard. And then particularly in your all's environment, parasite control as necessary. Those all have the opportunity to impact the value of cattle. Okay, but from a weaning and preconditioning standpoint, if you're going to wean calves, I don't see any reason to not use that as an opportunity to slightly extend that period and precondition those calves as well. Okay, if we're going to make that a profitable venture, okay, or profitable enough, for lack of better terms, we got to manage them in a way that's going to yield a positive return on the investment. Okay. And then we got to market them in a way that captures enough added value to make it worthwhile. Okay. If we look at the current market conditions in this year, and this is some of the work that Justin Benavidez, our ag economist here in the Panhandle, has done, is that the premiums that at least we've observed this year thus far for wean and preconditioned calves are almost double what they normally are. Okay, so we're estimating those premiums to be somewhere in the vicinity of $150 to $250 per head throughout this fall. Okay, so substantial opportunity to add some additional value to those calves. Reality is that premium is not free. It takes us some dollars to get there, and there's some things we need to be mindful of in doing that. And I'll mention a few things that we can do to help minimize some of those costs and increase the likelihood of a positive and a high magnitude return on investment of doing so. But most of our weaning and preconditioning programs are going to require calves to be weaned at least 45 days. Okay, those calves will be vaccinated with at least 2 doses against clostridial diseases, and then viral causes of respiratory disease, and possibly bacterial, depending upon the program. Going to require that those calves know how to eat from a feed bunk, and that they know how to drink water from a water trough. Okay, there's some things that we can do to try to help us do that, and I want to focus on those. The first of those that I think all of us have the opportunity to embrace, it might take a little bit of infrastructure change and some investment, would be fence line weaning. Okay, I know very few, actually I don't know off the top of my head of anyone who tried fence line weaning, committed to doing it, and doing what was necessary to effectively fence line wean calves, which really means having a perimeter quality fence to separate those cows and calves, or even better, 2 fences. But I know no one that off the top of my head that has tried it and said, nope, this wasn't worthwhile. This didn't return enough of the investment for me. Okay. Reality is, if we're going to do that, it's going to allow calves to see that we need to have a fence line that allows cows to see the calves and vice versa, but effectively keep them separate. Okay. Our goal is to minimize stress throughout that weaning process, and fence line weaning is the practice that I've seen that is the most effective way of doing that. If that's not possible, if we're in a situation where we can't fence line wean, then we need to go to the far opposite side of that spectrum. We need to keep those cows as far away from those calves as possible, or vice versa. Okay, we either want them to be close enough to where they can see and hear one another easily, or far enough away to where they can't see or hear one another at all. Okay, those are our two best options, but certainly the preference going to the fence line weaning option. Get a lot of questions on nose flaps or weaning devices, weaners, as some people will refer to them. From the numbers I've worked through and seen and practical experiences, I don't believe they provide benefit from a weaning standpoint. And I think there's a lot of situations where those do nothing more than potentially increase stress of those calves. Now I realize there might be some people on that use them and love them. And I'm a firm believer of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay. And so that's not me telling you don't use them. The data I've seen and my experiences have been that they're not gonna likely be a valuable component of a weaning program. Okay. I did see that there was a hand raised, and it looks like we've got another question that came in. So what's the ideal weight that feedlots would prefer calves to come in at? That's going to be very dependent upon the feed yard and what they specialize in. Here in my part of the world, we place very few calf feds unless those are right now beef on dairy cross calves. But in terms of conventional beef cattle, here in the panhandle, the majority of our calves that are placed would be yearlings somewhere in the 700 to 800 pound range. Okay. But there are some feed yards that don't want calves that heavy. Okay. Some feed yards may prefer calves that are smaller. So it becomes really, really dependent upon the yard, what their feed costs are, how their business is structured. And unfortunately, there's really not a one size fits all answer to that. What I will say though, and you mentioned this at the end of your question, with grain prices being what they are, would heavier be more valuable? And that is typically the case. We typically see as feed costs increase, we see more demand for heavy cattle. As feed costs decrease, we see more demand for light cattle, or we see those things fluctuate because it's cheaper to add gain or it's more expensive to add gain. And so in the current environment with high feed prices, I would say trying to make this an apples to apples comparison, generally speaking, anything we can do to add weight to those cattle prior to them getting to the feed yard, as long as we can do that at a cost that's less than what it costs the feed yard to put it on, is going to be advantageous. Okay. That may be a little different if we're retaining ownership in those calves versus somebody else buying them from us as well. But I don't see any issue if we're comparing 6.5 weight calves to 7.5 weight calves. I don't see any issue with that extra 100 pounds. Just understand, those are conversations to have with those that might be potentially interested in purchasing those cattle. But ultimately, I think we're seeing more demand right now for some of those heavier cattle than we are for some of those more lightweight calves. Okay. Creep feeding. So I get asked a lot of questions about creep feeding, and I do believe it can be a valuable component of a weaning and preconditioning program. With that being said, I do not believe that creep feeding as we conventionally think about it, so offering creep feed to calves as young and as early as they're able and willing to start eating feed all the way through weaning, generally speaking, that does not yield a positive return on its investment. Okay. Where I believe creep feeding can be of value is when we creep feed calves for a short period of time, leading up to that weaning and preconditioning time. And that's because calves know what feed is and they know what to do with it. And that substantially helps to decrease the stress associated with that weaning process. Really, when we wean them, feed then is the only thing that's familiar to them and they know what to do with it. Okay. And when I say a short period of time, I'm really talking 4 weeks, 6 weeks or so prior to weaning time. At that time, calves have really just found creep feed and really started to hit their stride in eating it. But it really helps to ease that transition. It also helps us to increase how those calves grow and develop during that weaning and preconditioning period. And we've got some data to back that up. So if we look at calves that were creep fed for a 45-day period of time prior to weaning versus those that were not, those calves that were creep fed, once they were weaned, and if they were managed, all those calves were managed the same, those that were creep fed ate more during that weaning and preconditioning process, but they had far greater average daily gain during that same period of time, but at a disproportionate level. Okay, so a 7% increase in intake, but almost a 20% increase in average daily gain. Those calves were more efficient during that weaning and preconditioning phase. And I would argue in some situations, just that benefit alone is enough to potentially cover the cost of having creep fed those calves previously. Then additionally, we'd hope we'd have some additional gain on those calves that has some value as well. So I'd typically expect that to yield a positive return on investment. This year, with feed prices being what they are, we got to put pencil to paper to see if that would be a worthwhile investment for us or not. Okay. Our best case scenario for weaning and preconditioning calves is high quality stockpiled forages. High quality hay works really well too, but when I say high quality hay, think horse quality hay. Okay. If we do that, we give them free choice access to it, at least initially during that weaning and preconditioning phase. That's going to substantially help to minimize that shrink associated with weaning and help to promote weight gain. Okay. And then we need to focus on supplementing those calves as necessary to achieve our growth targets. Okay, so to get them to where we want them to be come sale day or come delivery day. Amount is going to depend on the quality of that supplemental feed, but also the quality and abundance of the pasture or the hay. Typically, we're going to expect to need to supplement those calves somewhere in the vicinity of 0.5 to 1.5% of their body weight in supplement to get them there. Where I think we often overlook and make some mistakes from a nutrition standpoint on preconditioning calves is mineral nutrition. A good quality complete free choice mineral supplement is going to yield a positive return on its investment. We would generally expect it to improve average daily gain in preconditioning calves or stocker cattle by anywhere from 10 to upwards of 30%. We know it's going to influence their immune system and decrease morbidity, and they're going to be more likely to respond to treatment in the event that they do get sick. Okay. I believe that should begin at the cow-calf level. Okay. So those calves should have an adequate mineral status come weaning time, and we just need to keep that status where it is. For most of us, a loose bag mineral supplement is going to be the most economical means of meeting their mineral and vitamin requirements and potentially addressing any previous deficiencies. Okay. The last one I want to focus on are two major aspects of nutritional management, in addition to those that I've already mentioned, and that would be using growth promotants. And the two specific ones I want to focus on are ionophores, and then I'll mention a little bit about implants at the end. Ionophores, if you aren't familiar with them, these are antimicrobial drugs that are not used in human medicine. They do not require a veterinary feed directive, at least not if they're the only drug used in that feed or in that supplement. So these would be drugs like Rumensin or Monovet would be the two main Monensin options, and then Bovatec would be the Lasalicet option. We're typically going to expect them to yield at least a 3 to 5% improvement in feed efficiency. In a lot of situations, particularly in growing cattle, we'd expect that to be a little higher. We get some coccidiosis prevention and control out of those products, as well as partial bloat mitigation. So if we're in a scenario where bloat has been a problem for us previously, they're quite effective at mitigating bloat. We expect them to cost somewhere in the vicinity of an additional 4 cents or 4 pennies per head per day. Okay, and so with those benefits, they're absolutely capable of yielding a positive return on their investment. The last I want to mention is implants, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this. I've covered this in a previous webinar that I believe is recorded and that y'all have access to. And so if you're interested in implants and haven't already seen it or didn't watch it live, I'd encourage you to go back and check that one out. But we do have the opportunity to add value to feeder cattle in almost all situations by implanting them if we're not already doing so. We typically expect on average, we're gonna, I often am conservative, and I would say a 3 to 5% improvement in average daily gain or weaning weight from that implant. But our historical data, and these are averages or an average over 58 different trials, would be closer to 6% improvement in weaning weight using any of the 3 major suckling calf implants that we commonly use. Depending upon size of calves we're weaning, that could be anywhere from 10 to 50 pounds of additional weaning weight, which is economically relevant. Okay. If we look at the value or what people are willing to pay for calves, if those calves are designated as implanted or non-implanted, people are willing to pay the same money for implanted calves as they are for non-implanted calves. But we have that added benefit of expecting those calves to be considerably heavier. That implant doesn't, at the cow-calf level, does not influence how that calf responds to implants or how it performs at the feed yard or what its carcass looks like. In terms of return on investment, we're expecting in this scenario, in the current market conditions, somewhere in the vicinity of a little over $30 in added calf value from the implant. That's compared to just not implanting the calf and not changing anything about how we're marketing them, but a complete return on investment of somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 1. A question I'm always asked is, okay, well, that's fine, but I can get more value out of calves by marketing them through a branded program that restricts or prohibits the use of implants. And the thing I would encourage you to do is evaluate that very critically. I'm only aware of roughly 2 programs that offer premiums that may be enough to outweigh the added value of implanting that calf. And one of those programs is hit or miss as to whether or not that premium is going to be enough to justify the opportunity cost or what we're missing out on in terms of added weight by not implanting that calf. In this scenario, and these were for 7-weight NHTC type calves that would actually be marketed to get that premium of, in our current market, about $2 per hundredweight. The advantage still goes to the implant by somewhere in the vicinity of $25 to almost $30 per head. So I'd encourage you, if you're not implanting calves because you're selling those feeder cattle through a branded program that restricts their use or prohibits their use, just make sure you're not leaving more opportunity on the table by not doing it. Got a lot of options and opportunity to utilize implants. So again, I'd encourage you to review that other recorded webinar if you haven't already, and if you've got specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Last thing I want to mention is duration of preconditioning. Oftentimes we're weaning and preconditioning calves and counting the days until we can sell them. Particularly for calves that don't take weaning very easily, we have a lot of opportunity to return some additional investment by extending that preconditioning phase beyond 45 days. A lot of times those calves that didn't take weaning very easily are just starting to hit their stride, and their gain's going to be backloaded. Those calves have shrunk enough that it took them 30 to 45 days just to get back to their initial weaning weight. In that situation, the only added value is that we're being able to market them as being weaned and preconditioned. And in some situations, we're going to be lucky if that returns 100% of the investment or a little over 100% of the investment. Generally speaking, it will return a little more than the overall investment if we're just getting them back to their starting point. But for a lot of us, that additional juice was not necessarily worth the squeeze, as my brother would put it. If we've got the opportunity to capitalize on some of that backloaded gain, so those calves that compensate a little bit once we get them on feed and get them started, so from that 45 to, let's say, 60-day or so period of time, we certainly ought to consider that. Just be mindful of the boxes that you have to check for your for the way or the method you're going to sell your calves, because certain weaning and preconditioning programs have certain timeline requirements for vaccination programs, and we just need to make sure that we're still adhering to those. We don't want to find out that we extended the period by 15 days and now we can't market those cattle. Okay, I don't think that's a reason to not extend that period when it makes sense. It's just something we need to be mindful of and plan our vaccination programs accordingly to correspond with that. Okay. We've got the opportunity to make genetic selection and management decisions that ultimately impact the value of feeder cattle. I'd encourage you to identify and integrate those that are going to actually have a real impact on your operation. But ultimately, at the end of the day, and I think this was brought out with that initial question, which was a really good one, we've got to market those calves in a way that allows you to capture that added value. Because otherwise, if we're doing things that cost us more money to do them, yeah, they might be the right thing for the industry, and I'm 100% for that. But the reality is, if we're operating a business, for it to be sustainable, it has to be profitable. Okay. And so we certainly need to consider that. One last parting thought that I'll leave you with is, right now, a lot of these things are optional. It is my opinion that there will eventually come a time where that is no longer the case. I believe that there will be a time where we no longer have the ability to market high risk cattle, cattle that have been mismanaged, or cattle that are likely to experience morbidity and or die later on during this beef production process. We're starting to see that out here now already at the feed yard level. And what I qualify that with is one of the major nationwide packers, but one of the packers in the region will now only accept cattle from feed yards that have at least one employee that is BQA certified. Okay, that's being dictated and being passed down at the retail level. Okay. And so that's something for us to keep in mind, because I think that is the segue. That is the beginning of no longer having certain options, and some of these things no longer being optional and eventually becoming mandatory if we want to be able to market cattle. That's my opinion, and feel free to call me out on that if I wind up being wrong. I don't know if that's 3 years down the road or 30 years down the road, but it is my opinion that we will see that. And so I want to do everything I can to help position you all in a way, and hope you'll embrace that opportunity to be positioned in a way to be ready to respond to that in the event that it should happen, if you choose not to be proactive and do that now. But that's it. That's all I've got for y'all this evening. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to visit with y'all. I appreciate the questions we've gotten so far. Looks like there's maybe a couple more that have come in, so I'm going to go ahead and read through those really quickly. And please don't hesitate to keep those questions coming. I'm happy to stay on as long as I need to answer those questions. So the first of those, how do you market bunk fed or exposed during the sale process? I think that starts with a conversation with the person that is marketing those cattle for you. And so if we're marketing cattle at the local or regional livestock auction or sale barn, I think that starts with having conversations with that manager or that owner if they're the same people. But I think that's where we start, is by having conversations. And what that does is that helps them start to build a reputation for your cattle among the people that purchase them. And so again, I think that's the first place to start. If we're not marketing cattle that way, we're marketing cattle through a video auction or directly or some other way. Again, I think it comes down to communication. Whether that's documentation or documentation and verification, depending upon what it is we're trying to market, or that's as simple as a phone discussion or a conversation with that person. But I think communication is the key to doing that, because that marketer can then tell you not only if those things are likely going to add value if you're marketing cattle through them, but they can tell you potentially when you need to market those cattle to capture as much of that value as possible. Because the reality is, if there's 30 weaned and preconditioned calves there and that's it, they're not going to be worth any more than any of the others, because they're going on the same truck as the others, and they're going to go in the same pen, and they're filling the same order that order buyer had, which was likely not for weaned and preconditioned calves. Okay, so they've got to be marketed in a way that there's actually going to be buyers there for those cattle. And y'all have some groups in Tennessee that have been at the forefront historically of doing some of those things and being able to get some of those buyers on the line or in the seat to bid on those cattle. Okay, next question: how often should you implant? Okay, at the cow-calf level, okay. At the cow-calf level, I would argue for suckling pre-weaned calves, there's not enough benefit in re-implanting those calves to justify doing it. So I'm a proponent of one implant on those calves, and preferably that implant going in at what we'd call branding out here, but essentially the beginning of the breeding season. So when calves are roughly 60 or so days old. 60 to 90 days is probably going to be the sweet spot on most of those calves, or even at the same time of pre-weaning vaccinations. Federally, from a regulatory or regulation standpoint and legality standpoint, we can only implant calves once within a given production phase. Okay, so we can legally only implant calves with most, unless that implant is labeled to be re-implanted within that phase. So our three most common calfhood implants, so Ralgro, Synovex C, and Component EC with Thailand, none of those three are labeled to be re-implanted. The only two that are approved to be administered to suckling steer calves only, that are approved to be re-implanted within a production phase, would be Compudos and Encore. Okay. Beyond that, if we're finishing cattle, there's absolutely value in re-implanting those calves. If we're running stocker cattle for an extended period of time, there might be value in re-implanting those calves. But again, it has to be an implant that is labeled for re-implant, and that is something that FDA has mentioned that they plan to begin to potentially enforce in some way, shape, or form, effective June of 2023. Okay, good question though. Next question: can you discuss the value of organically raised grass-fed only beef? Okay, that's a question I might need a little more clarification on what you're really considering value in that. If we're from a value standpoint, generally speaking, there's a premium associated with that, but there have to be people that are willing to buy and pay that premium. and enough of a premium to justify the additional expense in doing that. At the relatively small scale and local level, there's some situations where there's potentially enough market and enough premium to justify the additional cost of raising cattle that way. From a conventional large scale standpoint, I think that my opinion and what I've seen from a data standpoint suggests there's not enough demand for that. And that ultimately the major factor that influences what people are willing to buy is what it costs. Where we often hear what we often hear referred to as value from a non-conventional production standpoint is often healthfulness or sensory or meat quality attributes. The data that I'm familiar with, and there's been a lot of work done in this area, quite a bit of that work's been done at A&M and other universities, but from a healthfulness standpoint, there's no health benefit to organic versus conventional. I don't want to call it non-organic, but organic versus conventional. So there's no health benefit. And then from a grass-fed standpoint, there's no health benefit to grass-fed versus conventionally raised beef. From a value of an eating experience and a perception standpoint, that tends to be very individually specific. There are people that are accustomed to and prefer the taste of corn-fed or grain-finished conventionally raised beef. There are people that may have a preference for the flavor of grass-fed beef, and that tends to be specific. That I think the average consumer, the data supports that they prefer the sensory attributes, so the flavor, the juiciness, and the tenderness is the three primary ones of conventionally raised or fed beef compared to grass-fed. I would argue that in most situations, if we just look at product in the retail case, or if we're comparing just visually the average conventionally fed beef versus the average grass-finished beef, and if price were equal, almost 100% of the time the consumer is going to pick the conventionally raised beef. If there's an aspect of that question, I know I tackled it from a number of different angles. There's an aspect of that question that I didn't address or answer, please chat in with a follow-up to that, and I'd be happy to answer it. I know most of those answers were in favor in some way, shape, or form of conventional or grass-fed. If you've got a market for organic and or grass-fed beef, and there's enough premium associated with it, heck yeah, sell it. The thing I would encourage you to do, and the same as I would encourage to a conventional producer, would be let's sell it to that market. Let's capitalize on that opportunity, but let's not market it at the disadvantage of beef that's produced in other ways. I certainly want to discourage anyone from doing that. An example, and I can't remember who I need to quote. I think it was maybe John Mayday with Drovers Cattle Network. I've got this slide in a presentation that we do at our Texas A&M Beef Cattle Short Course in August. It's actually the closing slide of the closing set of presentations that I do. But regardless, the quote says, "If somebody wants brown eggs, let's sell them brown eggs. Let's not sell them not white eggs." And I think that same concept applies here to however that animal was raised. Let's take the opportunity to add some premiums and increase profitability if we can. Let's just not do that at the expense of other our partners, our brothers and sisters and cousins and everybody in the industry. Got a nice comment in there about the presentation. Thank you very much. I hope it is beneficial to everyone. And I don't know, we're getting short on time, but it looks like most everyone's still on. If there's questions that I didn't answer or follow-ups to any of those questions, I'll hang on for another couple minutes if anybody wants to send those in through the Q&A. Or Mallory, I don't know if you've gotten any through any other any other outlets. I don't know if people text them into you or anything like that, but if there's any others that have come in that I haven't seen, just let me know.
No, you're good. Our chat box is empty and our Q&A box, as far as questions, is empty. We really appreciate you coming on and speaking to us tonight. Again, if
You're
anybody
welcome.
has any last second questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or Q&A box. Once you exit the webinar, please fill out those surveys. We certainly appreciate you all doing that over the course of these webinars. And if you have any further questions about the webinar series itself, please feel free to contact your local extension agent. Me or Dr. Mason will be happy to answer those for you. But other than that, we're finished.
All right. Well, thank you all. Certainly appreciate the time. I think my contact information is still up there on the screen. So if anybody has follow-up questions or thinks of a question, really anytime, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Smith. We really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for tuning in tonight.
Thank you all. Hope everyone has a good night.